I never imagined that my quiet retirement as governor would end with a homeowners association, HOA, president trying to steal my home of 50 years through a massive fraud scheme. But when they destroyed my late wife's memorial bench and tried bulldozing my rose garden at midnight, I had to ask myself, what would happen if they discovered they had just messed with the wrong governor? Welcome, and please subscribe for more HOA stories. The knock at the door. The banging on my front door jolted me awake at 7 a.m. sharp. I was already exhausted from last night's late budget meeting at the governor's office, but someone clearly had other plans for my Sunday morning. Opening the door, I found Margaret Hayes, our new HOA president, tapping her foot with that familiar look of disapproval on her face. "Governor Thompson," she announced, waving her measuring tape like a weapon, "your roses are 3 inches taller than regulation height. This is your 4th violation this month." I looked past her at my wife, Emily's beloved rose garden, the one thing I'd promised to keep alive after cancer took her last year. Every morning for 49 years, she tended to those roses while I had my coffee on the porch. Now, they were apparently a crime against the neighborhood. "Margaret," I said calmly, "those roses have been here since 1972. The HOA didn't even exist until 1990. She pushed her designer sunglasses up her nose and thrust a paper into my hands. "New bylaws were passed last month. You should attend the meetings if you want to stay informed. Being governor doesn't make you special here." I bit back a response about how I'd missed the meeting because I was handling a state emergency. Instead, I watched her march across my lawn, measuring tape still in hand, to harass Paul Reynolds about his mailbox color. The eviction notice. That afternoon, while sorting through my mail, I found something strange, a letter addressed to current resident rather than my name. Inside was an eviction notice claiming I had 30 days to vacate the property. My hands started shaking. This had to be a mistake. I called Paul right away. He'd been my neighbor for 30 years and served on the original HOA board. "Hey, did you get any weird mail today, John?" I asked. "Thank goodness you called." Paul's voice was urgent. "I just saw your house listed for sale on Zillow posted this morning." My stomach dropped. "That's impossible. I own this house outright." "Well, somebody thinks differently. The listing agent is Hayes Real Estate Group, Margaret Hayes." The pieces started falling into place. Her constant harassment about the roses, the sudden new bylaws, the eviction notice. This wasn't about garden regulations at all. Emily's letter. I spent the next hour digging through my home office, searching for the original deed. When I finally found it in Emily's old filing system, another document fell out, a handwritten letter from her that I'd never seen before. "My dearest John," it began, "if you're reading this, something's gone wrong with the house. Check the bottom of my rose garden, 3rd bush from the left. I buried copies of all our important papers there in a waterproof box. You always tease me about being too careful with documents, but I had a feeling we'd need them someday." Even after she was gone, Emily was still protecting our home. I grabbed a shovel and headed to the garden, not caring that I was still in my suit from yesterday's meetings. As I dug beneath her favorite peace rose, I heard Margaret's voice coming from next door. "Of course it's legal," she was saying to someone on her phone. "The digital transition mixed up some ownership records, and we're simply correcting them. By the time anyone figures it out, the sale will be final." She laughed. "Even the governor can't fight City Hall." My shovel hit something hard. Inside the metal box, I found exactly what we needed. Our original deed, property surveys, and every HOA document we'd ever signed, including one from 1990 that specifically protected our pre-existing garden. I looked up to see Margaret watching me from across the fence. Her phone call forgotten for just a second, her confident mask slipped when she saw the box in my hands. Then she turned and rushed toward her house, already dialing another number. The state attorney. The sun was setting behind my home of 50 years, casting long shadows through Emily's roses as I held our property documents. I realized this wasn't just about keeping our house anymore. How many other homes had Margaret corrected during the digital transition? And more importantly, how did she not realize that a governor might know a thing or two about investigating fraud? I picked up my phone and called Daniel Carter, our state attorney. "Daniel," I said, "remember how you said you've been looking for a solid case against real estate fraud? I think I found something interesting in my own backyard." I heard Margaret's voice again, now shouting into her phone about emergency HOA meetings and document shredding. But for the first time all day, I smiled. Emily had always said our little Victorian house had chosen us for a reason. Maybe she was right. The trap. I couldn't sleep after finding that eviction notice, so I went down to my basement, where I keep all my important papers. My hands were shaking as I pulled out the old metal box Emily and I had bought when we first moved in. Inside was our original deed from 1973, the paper yellow with age but still perfectly readable. Next to it lay 50 years of property tax receipts, each one carefully filed by my Emily. She was always the organized one. The sound of a car door slamming made me look up through the basement window. A fancy real estate agent's car had parked in front of my house. My neighbor Paul Reynolds was running across his lawn in his pajamas, trying to wave them away. I hurried upstairs and opened my front door just in time to hear the agent say, "The open house is scheduled for this weekend." "There must be some mistake," I said, still holding my old deed. "I never listed my home for sale." The agent gave me a puzzled look and pulled out her tablet. According to the county records, this property was just listed by the Valley Creek HOA. She turned the screen toward me, and my heart nearly stopped. There was my home, listed for $850,000, with pictures I'd never seen before. The investigation. I called my old friend Daniel at the county records office right away. While I waited for him to check the files, I went through more of my papers. That's when I found something strange, a notice from 6 months ago about the HOA modernizing their records. Margaret had made a big deal about going paperless, saying it would make everything easier. I hadn't paid much attention then. I was dealing with a state budget crisis. Paul came over with his laptop. He's good with computers, much better than me. Together, we looked at the HOA's new online system. My stomach dropped when we found my property record. According to their database, I had transferred my deed to the HOA during the digital transition, but I had never signed anything like that. "Look at this," Paul said, pointing to his screen. He'd found 5 other homes in our neighborhood that had similar transfers, all belonging to people who'd lived here for decades. All of them had gotten complaints from Margaret about their yards or paint colors in the past year. Just then, Daniel called back. "Governor," he said, his voice serious, "something's not right here. The digital deed has a signature date from 3 months ago, but according to my records, you were giving a speech in the Capitol that day. I'm looking at the video right now." My security team called next. They'd spotted someone taking pictures of my house. When they went to investigate, the person claimed to be measuring for renovation work ordered by the HOA. I hadn't approved any renovations. The emergency meeting. I was writing all this down when I got an email from Margaret. "Just wanted to remind you that the HOA has full authority to maintain community standards. The buyers this weekend are a lovely young couple. They understand the importance of proper lawn care, unlike some of our current residents." The pieces were starting to fit together, and I didn't like the picture they made. Margaret's real estate company handling all the HOA's transferred properties, the sudden complaints about long-time residents, the mysterious digital transition. My years in politics had taught me to spot a scheme, and this had all the marks of one. A movement caught my eye through the window. More cars were pulling up outside. Through the gathering darkness, I could see Margaret directing people with clipboards toward my front porch. She looked up, saw me watching, and gave me that same smirk she'd had at last week's HOA meeting when she'd complained about my roses. My phone buzzed, a text from Laura Bennett, the HOA secretary. "Governor, please check your email. There's something you need to see about the records transfer. But don't let Margaret know I sent it." The showdown. The emergency HOA meeting was packed with worried neighbors when I walked in. I hadn't worn my usual suit and tie today. I came in my gardening clothes, dirt still fresh on my knees from checking on Emily's roses one last time. Margaret's face turned red seeing me dressed so casually. She always hated how I kept working in my garden even after becoming governor. I took my seat in the front row, placing my old leather briefcase on the floor. Inside was every piece of paper showing I owned my home since 1973. Paul sat next to me, squeezing my shoulder for support. The room buzzed with whispers. Nobody had ever seen an emergency meeting called so suddenly. Margaret stood at the podium in her fancy red blazer, tapping her manicured nails on the wood. "Governor Thompson," she said, my title like it was something gross. "I assume you're here to discuss the property situation." "You could say that," I replied, keeping my voice steady like Emily taught me during my first campaign. "I'm here about you trying to sell my home without my permission." The room got so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum. Margaret's smile got bigger, more dangerous. She pulled out a thick stack of papers from her designer bag. Actually, she said, according to our new digital record system, you haven't owned that property since last year's database update. I stood up slowly, my knees creaking a bit. Margaret, I've lived in that house for 50 years. I have every document since 1973 right here. I patted my briefcase. You can't just type something into a computer and make my home yours to sell. Oh, but I can. She waved her papers around. See, when we updated our systems, we found several irregularities. Your property wasn't properly registered under the new HOA guidelines. Therefore, ownership has defaulted to the association. The neighbors started muttering. Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street stood up. That's ridiculous. John's lived there longer than anyone. Margaret banged her gavel. The rules are the rules. If you don't properly register your property during a system update, you forfeit your rights. It's all in Section 47B of the new bylaws. That's when I smiled, reaching into my briefcase. Interesting you mentioned those new bylaws, Margaret. I have here the original HOA agreement from 1980. It clearly states that any changes to registration requirements must be approved by a 75% vote of homeowners. I pulled out another paper. And look what I found in the county records. No such vote ever happened. Margaret's face went pale. She shuffled through her papers faster. That's not relevant. The digital transition supersedes the law. A deep voice came from the back. I'd be very interested in hearing how a computer database supersedes 50 years of legal property records. It was Daniel Carter, my old friend and state attorney. He stood up, and the room erupted. The fall of Margaret Hayes. Margaret backed away from the podium as neighbors started shouting questions. Through the chaos, I watched her pull out her phone, fingers flying over the screen. Later, we discovered she was deleting emails, but she didn't know about the backups Laura had already saved. Margaret, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. I think you should know I just signed an executive order this morning creating a state task force on housing fraud. Would you like to guess who's leading it? She ran for the door, high heels clicking on the tile floor, but Daniel was faster. 2 police officers were already waiting in the lobby. I saw her designer bag drop to the floor, spilling more papers that would lead us down a rabbit hole none of us expected. Paul picked up the gavel Margaret had left behind. I moved for an immediate vote to remove Margaret Hayes as HOA president. All in favor. Every hand in the room shot up. But somehow, I knew this was just the beginning. The aftermath. I sat in my study, staring at the walls of evidence we'd gathered against Margaret. Something wasn't adding up. The paper trail was too messy for someone as careful as her. That's when Laura Bennett, our HOA secretary of 15 years, knocked on my door with tears in her eyes and a USB drive in her shaking hands. Governor Thompson, she whispered, closing the door behind her. Margaret didn't just target your home. There's so much more. My security team swept the USB drive before I plugged it into my computer. What we found made my blood run cold. Spreadsheets, property records, fake documents, all meticulously organized by date and neighborhood. Margaret hadn't just changed my property records. She'd been slowly taking over homes throughout the entire county. I called Paul Reynolds, who lived next door to 3 empty houses Margaret's company had recently acquired. He came over immediately, bringing his daughter Sophie, a data analyst who'd been suspicious about the neighborhood's property records for months. Look at this pattern, Sophie said, pointing to her laptop screen. Every target is either elderly, too busy with work to notice the paperwork changes, or living out of state. Margaret's company swoops in, claims there are HOA violations, then suddenly discovers ownership problems. Laura's hands trembled as she pulled up more files. I started keeping records when she first joined the HOA board 5 years ago. At first, it was just weird things, changing meeting minutes, losing complaint forms from certain homeowners. Then I noticed property documents going missing from our files. Paul paced my study, his face getting redder by the minute. Remember the Andersons? They lived here for 40 years. Margaret claimed they'd agreed to sell their house because of HOA violations. They moved to Florida last year, heartbroken. I picked up my phone, but Laura grabbed my arm. Wait, there's more. Margaret has a whole network, real estate agents, contractors, even someone at the county records office. They're all in on it. Sophie pulled up another document that made my heart stop. A list of future targets. 30 more homes in our neighborhood alone. Next to each address were notes about the owner's vulnerabilities. Next to my name, it said, "Too busy with state duties to notice changes. Wife deceased. Emotional attachment to property makes proper legal review unlikely." They'd been studying us, learning our weaknesses, using our lives against us. The final confrontation. I thought about my rose garden, the one Emily had helped me plant when we first moved in. Margaret hadn't targeted it because it violated HOA rules. She targeted it because she knew it would distract me with grief and anger while she worked on stealing my home. Laura showed us emails revealing Margaret's next move. She planned to present evidence at next week's HOA meeting that several more residents had failed to properly transfer their deeds during the digital transition. It would look like a simple clerical error that just needed to be corrected. "The thing is," Sophie said, pointing to her screen, "I checked the original county records. None of these ownership changes ever went through proper legal channels. Margaret's been creating parallel paperwork that looks official but isn't properly registered. She's counting on no one checking the actual county records." As we dug deeper, Paul noticed something odd about the dates. Every property takeover attempt happened during major state events, when I'd be too busy to pay attention to neighborhood drama. I sat back in my chair, finally understanding Margaret's full game. She hadn't just been stealing homes. She'd been building an empire right under our noses, using our trust in the HOA system against us. The question wasn't just about saving my home anymore. It was about stopping her before she destroyed our entire community. Laura stood up straighter, her fear turning to anger. "I have copies of everything, Governor. Every email, every fake document, every secret meeting recording. I've been saving them for years, waiting for someone strong enough to take her down." I looked at the faces around me. Laura's determination, Paul's righteous anger, Sophie's analytical focus. Margaret might have money and connections, but we had truth and community on our side. And she was about to learn that messing with people's homes was a dangerous game, especially when one of those people had the full power of the governor's office behind them. The end of an era. Sophie's laptop pinged with a new alert. Margaret had just called an emergency HOA meeting for tomorrow night. We looked at each other, knowing this was it. The time for gathering evidence was over. Now, we had to decide. Did we spring our trap, or was Margaret about to spring hers? The final chapter. The morning sun hit my face as I knelt in my rose garden, carefully planting a new Emily's Love rose bush. My hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but each flower I planted felt like a small victory. Paul Reynolds, my neighbor of 30 years, walked over with 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Never thought I'd see the day Margaret Hayes would end up behind bars," he said, handing me a cup. "The news is calling it the biggest real estate scam in state history." I smiled, remembering how this all started with one simple rose garden dispute. The media trucks had finally left my driveway yesterday after camping out for 3 weeks straight. Turns out, people love stories about corrupt HOA presidents trying to steal the governor's house. Laura Bennett joined us, carrying a thick folder. As our new HOA president, she'd been working overtime to fix the mess Margaret left behind. "You won't believe what we found in the old records," she said, sitting on Emily's new memorial bench. Margaret tried the same scheme in 3 other neighborhoods before moving here. She'd target older residents, mess with property records during tech upgrades, then force quick sales through her company. My security detail, Mike, walked up with his morning report. "Sir, we've identified 28 more victims across the state. The FBI is involved now." He paused, then added, "And Mrs. Hayes is trying to make a deal with the prosecutors." I shook my head, remembering Margaret's face when they arrested her. She'd screamed about conspiracy theories and threatened to expose my corrupt administration. What she never understood was that I'd spent my whole career fighting people like her, folks who thought rules didn't apply to them. The neighborhood kids rode by on their bikes, waving at Governor John as they passed. One of them, little Annie from 2 doors down, stopped to give me a hand-drawn card. Inside was a picture of my rose garden with the words, "Our hero," written in crayon. My phone buzzed, another message from the state attorney general. They wanted me to testify at Margaret's trial next month. I thought about declining, about just enjoying my retirement in peace. But then I looked at Emily's bench, remembered how Margaret's goons had smashed the original one, and knew I had to see this through. Paul helped me up, my knees creaking in protest. You know what Emily would say about all this? He asked with a knowing smile. She'd laugh herself silly, I replied, touching the smooth wood of her new bench. Then she'd tell me to stop fussing and plant more roses. Laura spread out some papers on the bench. Look at these new HOA bylaws we've drafted. Full digital transparency, triple verification for property record changes, and mandatory resident voting on major decisions. She pointed to a specific section. We're calling it the Thompson Rule. I felt tears welling up but blinked them away. Emily always said crying was just the heart's way of watering hope. And right now, hope was blooming all over our neighborhood. Families who'd lost their homes to Margaret's scheme were moving back in. The community was healing. As the morning wore on, more neighbors stopped by, each had a story about Margaret's bullying, about feeling helpless against her schemes. But now, they also had stories of victory, of justice, of community coming together. My rose garden had become a symbol of standing up to corruption, one flower at a time. I looked at my home of 50 years, its Victorian charm unchanged despite Margaret's best efforts to take it away. Sometimes, the biggest battles start in the smallest places, a garden, a bench, a home. And sometimes, just refusing to back down can change everything. Standing there with my neighbors, watching the roses catch the morning light, I realized this wasn't just about saving my house anymore. It was about protecting the places and people we love, about standing up to bullies who think they're above the law. I picked up my gardening tools, ready to plant another rose bush. After all, I had a lot more flowers to plant and a community to rebuild.